second presenter is Professor Karin Amit from the Department of Business and Administration at Ruppin Academic Center. Karin is also head of the MA program on immigration and social integration at the Ruppin Academic Center. Her current research interests are economic and social integration of immigrants, immigrants' identity, sense of belonging, involvement of social network, and leadership in the immigration decision. Karin has published extensively papers on this issue. Her works published inside journals of Social Indicators Research, Journal of Ethnic Immigration Studies, Journal of Immigrant and Refugee Studies. So, Karin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So it's going to be a little bit different because I'm going to present a quantitative research. So it will be challenging. I hope you'll bear with me and follow me. So I'm going to present here a joint paper that I wrote with Dr. Svetlana Chachashvili-Bolotin. And this paper focuses on immigrants' labor market integration. And it was published, just published in Frontiers in Sociology in a special issue edited by Professor Moshe Semyonov, who is here. And before I present our research question, I would like to first give you some background on labor market. Okay. So, as you may all know, labor market serves as a central arena of immigrant integration. For many years, however, studies documenting the integration of immigrants into the labor market focused mainly on objective parameters, looking at earnings and occupational attainment. However, subjective parameters are gaining more interest from migration scholars, and especially I'm going to focus here on subjective parameters related to labor market integration, meaning the job satisfaction and the income satisfaction of immigrants. Although there is more and more scholars are looking at it, yet there has been no comprehensive study that actually analyzes and compares both subjective and objective parameters of labor market integration. So in this sense, the fact that an immigrant is very satisfied with his job or with his position in the labor market doesn't necessarily mean that he's actually doing fairly well in the labor market. This possible mismatch between the subjective and the objective parameters is what we focus here, and this is our interest. And traditionally, studies looking at the mismatch in the labor markets traditionally looked at the mismatch between, or the imperfect match between education and jobs. Here we suggest something different. We suggest a perceptional mismatch between the objective parameters and the subjective parameters related to labor market integration. So we have two forms of this perceptional mismatch. The positive subjective mismatch, which occurs when individuals' perceptions are higher than the actual position in the labor market. Negative subjective mismatch, which occurs when the individual perceptions are lower than their actual position in the labor market. And in this study, we try to look at gender effect and ethnicity or migration/migration effect, and also try to detect variables that can predict the positive and the negative subjective mismatch. So our question we have two main questions. The first question is, are women satisfied with less? We looked at the literature and we found that there is a paradox called the paradox of the content female worker. According to this paradox, women tend to be more satisfied with their job, although if we look at their actual integration or their position in the workplace compared to men, it is less favorable. The literature explained it using the expectation and stating that women have lower expectation and thus are more satisfied with what they get. So our first hypothesis is that the positive subjective mismatch is more typical for women than for men, and a negative subjective mismatch will be and is more typical for men than for women. Our second question goes to the ethnicity factor or effect. And here we ask, are individuals from disadvantaged ethnic or migration groups are satisfied with less? And here there are also studies that documented that and stated that disadvantaged ethnic groups and minority perceive that they have greater barriers in the labor market, and thus they have lower expectation to start with, and sometimes even lower self-efficacy and confidence in their success. So our second hypothesis was that a positive subjective mismatch is more apparent among disadvantaged ethnic and immigrant groups, and here we refer to the second generation of Mizrahim, people originating from Asia and Africa, Ethiopian immigrants, and Arab citizens, whereas the negative subjective mismatch is more apparent among advantaged ethnic groups or groups in general, second generation Ashkenazim, originating in Europe and America, and third generation Israeli born, and you will see it's a growing group which cannot be ethnically actually characterized. We found it quite challenging to say or to state the direction for former FSU, former Soviet Union immigrants, because this group does not match the other groups of categories, and I will talk about it later on. So in order to check and to examine our question, we use the CBS social survey data. We pulled together social surveys from 2013 to 2015 in order to obtain larger samples, because we wanted to actually have a representative sample of the entire Israeli population. In these surveys, they include questions, and this is why we use them, referring to objective parameters as well as subjective parameters. And we focused on individual age 25 to 60 because we are asking questions related to the workforce. And we have 8 population groups, both of immigrants and Israeli born. So let's look at the groups. So we have 4 immigrant groups: immigrants coming from the former Soviet Union before the 90s, immigrants from Ethiopia before the 80s, Western immigrants mainly from North America and European countries, and veteran immigrants, which cannot be classified ethnically, but they came from various countries before the beginning of the 90s. And in the Israeli-born population, we have second generation Mizrahim, second generation Ashkenazim, third generation. You can see here that their number is quite growing in compared to other groups, and Israeli Arab citizens. In order to calculate the mismatch index, we first had to calculate 2 indices. Why it's not moving? 2 indices, one for the subjective integration index and the second for the objective one. The subjective integration index was measured by the mean of 2 questions. Are you satisfied with your income? And are you satisfied with your job? We transfer them into z-scores, and this is why we can compare them. And the actual integration index was measured by the mean of 2 variables, income and occupation, which was actually measured by PTM, whether the individual has a professional, technical, or managerial occupation. There is a correlation between the 2 indices, but it's not too high, so it means that it's not the same variables. Now, in order to have our main dependent variable, this perceptional subjective mismatch, it can consist of 3 categories. 1, the positive subjective mismatch. If the respondent's subjective integration was at least half standard deviation above his actual integration, it was positive. If it was half standard deviation below his actual integration, it was negative, and all other categories, options were the matched categories. So the findings. Now I'm going to show you some numbers. So first, I'll start with the descriptive statistic. I think it will be easier for all the people here. The positive subjective mismatch in the labor market by ethnicity and by gender. What we can see very clear that the women are in the blue bars and the men in the green bars, and we have all the groups here in the total. What we can see very clearly is that in general, women have higher positive subjective mismatch than men, okay? For all categories, regardless the place they come from. And then we asked, and we wanted to see what about the groups that we thought that were disadvantaged. Are they behaving like women in this sense? And we can see that Ethiopian immigrants, both men and women, yes, they have high positive subjective mismatch. Arab citizens as well. For the Mizrahim population, the second generation, it was only for women, right, but not for men. And actually, this is one of the interesting factors that we discovered in our study. When we looked at the actual income, the objective position of second-generation Mizrahim, they are doing fairly well compared to other groups. So maybe we look at them as a disadvantaged group, but it's not necessarily like this. Now let's look at the negative subjective mismatch, and it should be reversed. And here we can see also that in general, men have higher negative subjective mismatch than women. The yellow bars are higher. And when we look at the groups, we can also see the picture that second generation Ashkenazim, which we thought are advantage group, and veteran immigrants. And this is a group that is not ethnically classified. It consists of former Soviet Union of the 70s and other groups that came before the beginning of the 90s, and they are actually acting like a very advantaged group, and it's interesting for people studying mobility in the labor market. Another way to look at it is to put the positive and the negative in the same slide. And as you can see, these are all 16 groups. When W stands for women and M stands for men. And you can see that in general, the women are at the top of the positive subjective mismatch and at the bottom of the negative subjective mismatch. And for men, it's the other way around. And we can see that there are some of the groups that for men are acting like women. And this is according to what we thought in our hypothesis. So these are a lot of numbers, and I'm going to make it more clear, okay? So after the next step, after presenting the descriptive statistics, we perform a multinomial regression analysis. This is the full table with all the numbers. I'm going to make it easier. This is the model for all the variables that we entered, and here are only the significant parameters. So in general, the mismatch positive and both positive and negative subjective mismatch was compared to the match category. And each ethnic group was compared to the third generation immigrants. Now, what can we see here? First, we can see in red the variables that for them there was a symmetrical pattern, both in the negative and in the positive subjective mismatch. Meaning that for women, we can see that they are high on the positive, significantly high on the positive, and low on the negative. And also for several socioeconomic variables that we have, for example, religious people are high on the positive and low on the negative. And those who have an academic degree and live in the central part of Israel are low on the positive. They're acting like an advantage group, and high on the negative. So this was the symmetrical pattern. We can also see that for former Soviet Union immigrants, there is a match. They are more close to the match category, the only group actually that for them there is no imperfect matching. And then in blue, we can see those variables that for them there is no symmetrical pattern. It's either the positive subjective mismatch is significant, or the negative. And it goes to second generation Mizrahim, who are high on the negative, low on the negative, second generation Ashkenazim, Arabs, age and full-time employment. So if you conclude and try to look at it according to our hypothesis, the gender hypothesis was fully confirmed. The paradox of the female worker, the content female worker is working here as well. But for the ethnic hypothesis, it was not fully confirmed, only for several groups and only for the negative subjective mismatch. But we also found that some factors, socioeconomic factors, do have an influence on the prediction of positive subjective mismatch and negative subjective mismatch. So if I conclude this presentation, first of all, I think that it's important, and it was also mentioned before, to look at the subjective parts of integration in general, not just in the labor market, but of integration of immigrants in general, because some of the explanation that we can have on why people are integrated, why they are not satisfied with their position, is related to these parameters exactly. We can also see that some of the patterns are not symmetrical, and it doesn't mean that if you're positive on one aspect, you're necessarily negative on the other one. It is also important to say that subjective parameters can be dynamic and they can change. So if, for example, women now have lower expectation, this is why we see this pattern, maybe in a couple of years it will change, it will not necessarily remain like this. And there is also the socioeconomic differences that are very important to understand as well, like religiosity and education and other variables that we entered into our equations. Thank you. They're shocked.
Perhaps you could add or maybe go back to things that you said in terms of the definition of satisfaction. That is, on one hand, you have objective data, but you also have attitudinal data.
That's right.
In the social survey. So can you elaborate a little bit on how you rank that?
Yes. First of all, most of the official data in Israel related to labor market does not have subjective parameters. They do not ask questions like, are you satisfied? And I think that the only survey, official survey, which is actually asking this question is the social survey. And it is done annually, but the numbers are smaller, and this is why we pull together. Now, they asked a couple of questions related to labor market, as well as they have in the survey also general questions like, are you satisfied with your life in general? And this is something that we looked at in different research. Here we wanted to focus on labor market satisfaction. So the question was, are you satisfied with the income you get from your work, from your job? And are you satisfied with the job that you're working now in the current workplace? And there was a high correlation between the two, and we computed it into one index.
That was really interesting and clear, and I can't even add, so I was really impressed. If we were going to take your data and think of it in policy terms,
Okay.
is the problem that women are too high or that men are too low? In other words, if we're thinking, I mean, there's a gap, and it sounded like you were suggesting, but you can correct me, that the issue has to do with kind of socio-cultural ideas of gender that lead women to be satisfied in ways they shouldn't be satisfied with their employment. Is that
Yes,
correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Is it also your hypothesis that men are under-satisfied? In other words, they should be more satisfied, and because of socio-cultural factors, they're not?
If we take if the explanation is related to expectation, we can say that women in the labor market have lower expectations. So it's a perceptional gap. So if, for example, if we want to take it to policy, maybe we have to encourage women to expect more from themselves. And then this gap will close. The fact that men are more, have higher expectations, some of the men, we saw that for disadvantaged group, the expectations are lower. So this is something that it's perceptional, it's dynamic, it can change. We can educate people to think differently or to be more confident about their selves. And yes, this is something that we can surely take into consideration when thinking about policies, educational policies.
Does this not also maybe have to do that the man usually has to sustain entire family? So obviously they have to earn more, and if they don't even get there, obviously they're less satisfied, whereas the woman maybe just takes on a side job and then they're more easily satisfied with that?
The paradox of the content female worker says that sometimes the women, and especially if some of the studies were conducted on Mexican women, on women from disadvantaged groups. And the fact is that they are grateful for having a job, okay? They are grateful for going out to work, and then they say, well, we're going to work because it's interesting and not because we want to earn a living, okay? Now, the fact that men are doing it, for example, if their income was high enough according to their expectations, they should be satisfied. But still, they are less satisfied, they want more, okay?
Ask also a question. And two, actually. One, it's just a suggestion. This theory of dual frame of reference for immigrants, when we see, for example, in the literature on the evaluation, let's say, of country institution, on satisfaction from the life among the immigrants, not among the second generation,
okay,
that their level of, the point of comparison, sometimes it's country of origin. And then immigrants who come in from country of origin with the low performance of country institution or with the low level of standard of living, the expectation from the beginning is lower. And then when they meet a country of a destination that has higher level of living or better country institution, then the evaluations are really higher than the evaluations of the local people, because they compare it to the expectation from the country from the beginning. So it may a little bit help
it
with
can be
the
one of the explanations.
comparison.
Yes, of course, but we cannot know exactly how the people think and what rationalization their process are having. Yeah.
And about the FSU women, because you now actually gave me the answer, because you say they do not know, but now,
right.
yes, because if you're talking about the FSU immigrants, not the second generation, the women were raised in the system where they went to work, but they went to work not to fulfill themselves, but to make a living. Yeah, it was it was equality in the labor market, but a lot of inequality at house, because the work of the women, at least this is what Soviet studies and people who focus on Russia say, that the equality in the labor market and inequality in the house was explained because women didn't went to work because she wanted to develop herself into health career. No, it was a functional for family function. Yeah. She needed to go to make the family function.
So here, FSU immigrants are women are acting like women. So in this sense, it's not, the fact that they are former Soviet Union does not matter. But when we look in general at men and this group, we see that there is a match. They get what they have, and they are satisfied with what they get. So for them, they act actually more rational than the other groups. So if it makes sense. If it makes sense. Okay.